the axe blade bites into frozen earth. It's February 5th, 1869. Bulldog Gully, Mulliagle, Victoria, Australia. The sun hammers down on a landscape already picked clean by 12 years of gold fever. John Deason drives his pick around the gnarled roots of a stringy bark tree, clearing space for one more hopeless dig. The soil here is different, harder, compressed. His blade strikes something that rings like stone. He stops. By 1869, Victorian goldfields had already surrendered over 20 million ounces of gold to the empire. The easy surface finds the nuggets you could pluck from creek beds with your bare hands. Those vanished in 1851. What remained were the deep lead miners. Men willing to sink shafts 200 feet into Paleozoic clay, risking cave-ins and carbon monoxide for a few pennyweights of dust. The Cornish miners who'd flooded Australia brought with them centuries of hard rock expertise, knowledge of adits and stamp mills and cyanide leaching. John Deason had none of that. He was a farmhand, a surface prospector, a man who worked dirt you could see, not rock you had to blast. His partner, Richard Oates, was cut from the same cloth, practical men who understood soil and rainfall and the way water moves through alluvial plains. They'd staked their claim at Bulldog Gully, not because geological surveys recommended it, but because nobody else wanted it. The experts, the mining engineers, with their theodolites and assay reports had declared this section worked. Out. Exhausted. The Melbourne Argus had published surveys showing that any significant gold deposits in Mulliagle lay at depths exceeding 150 feet, buried beneath tertiary basalt flows that required industrial equipment to penetrate. Deason and Oates had no industrial equipment. They had shovels, picks, and a wheelbarrow. They worked the surface like gardeners, turning soil that serious miners had trampled over for a decade, the problem facing every surface prospector in 1869 was mathematical and brutal. The Victoria goldfields had produced 1,156 tons of gold between 1851 and 1860. By 1869, annual production had collapsed to barely 60 tons. The rush was over. Men who'd abandoned farms in Cornwall and California to chase Australian gold were now abandoning the goldfields themselves, heading to newer strikes in New Zealand or back to wage work in Melbourne. The colonial government estimated that for every ounce of gold still being extracted, it took 12 man-hours of labor. At prevailing gold prices of £3.17 per ounce, that meant a miner earned roughly 6p an hour less than a dock worker. Without the dock worker's certainty of payment, conventional wisdom, the wisdom of the mining board, the wisdom of the geological surveys published in the Transactions of the Royal Society of Victorious, said that men like Deason were wasting their time. Surface gold was a myth, a fantasy. The only fortunes left in Victoria required capital: steam-powered pumps to drain deep shafts, stamp batteries to crush quartz reefs, cyanide vats to leach out microscopic gold from crushed ore. The era of the lone prospector was dead, except John. Deason's pick had just hit something that rang wrong. Not the dull thud of a tree root, not the sharp crack of quartz. Something else. Something that made the steel vibrate in his hands. He kneels, scrapes away red clay with his fingers. The object is 2 inches down, then 1 inch. Then he sees the color, that impossible yellow. John Deason was 38 years old. No formal education, no mining pedigree. He'd arrived in Victoria in 1852 from Cornwall. But unlike the hard rock miners who brought specialized knowledge of deep mining, Deason had worked as a laborer and small-scale farmer. His expertise was in reading land, understanding where water pooled, how soil composition changed, where old creek beds had shifted over geological time. These were skills a Victorian mining engineer would dismiss as rustic intuition, utterly lacking in the scientific rigor required for modern extraction. Richard Oates was even less impressive on paper. At 23, he was young, uneducated, and had spent most of his adult life doing manual labor on sheep stations. He had no capital, no connections to the Melbourne financial houses that funded the big mining syndicates. What he had was a strong back and a willingness to work ground that educated. Men had written off. They'd staked their claim at Bulldog Gully in 1868. The site had been worked over multiple times. The original prospectors in 1853 had taken the obvious surface gold and moved on. A second wave in 1855 had tried deeper pits and found nothing worth the effort. By 1860, the area was considered spent. The last mining company to attempt operations there, Moleagle Deep Lead Syndicate, had abandoned their claim. After sinking 2,000 pounds into exploratory shafts that yielded less than 3 ounces total. Deason and Oates were there because they had nowhere else to go. The why of their persistence is critical. By late 1868, both men were broke. Deason had a wife and children to feed. Oates had debts. They'd already endured 6 months of backbreaking labor at Bulldog Gully with minimal returns, just enough gold dust to buy flour and mutton, not enough to save. The conventional path forward was to abandon surface prospecting entirely. Either sign on with a deep lead mining company as wage laborers, or leave the gold fields for good. But Deason had noticed something the experts hadn't. Bulldog Gully sat at the intersection of 2 ancient creek systems. Modern hydrology would call it a confluent zone, a place where 2 streams had merged during the Pleistocene epoch, slowing water velocity and depositing heavier sediments. Deason didn't know the technical terms. He just knew that certain types of clay, certain patterns of root growth, indicated old water channels. And old water channels sometimes trapped gold. He'd also noticed something else. The big mining companies always dug in the same places. They followed published geological maps that identified proven gold-bearing stratomaps that were based on samples taken in 1852 and 1853. During the first rush, when tens of thousands of men had trampled every square foot of topsoil, those maps couldn't account for gold that had been covered after 1853, buried by erosion and hidden by falling trees, concealed beneath layers of wind-blown dust that accumulated over 15 years. Deason's theory, you could call it a theory, was simple. The surface wasn't exhausted. It was camouflaged, so he worked differently. He didn't dig pits. He didn't follow published lead lines. He worked around obstacle street routes, rock outcrops, spots where other miners hadn't bothered to look because the terrain seemed too difficult. On February 5, 1869, he was clearing dirt from around a stringy bark tree, not because geological principles suggested gold would be there, but because the roots created a natural depression that would have captured sediment during ancient floods. His pick struck at 11:30 in the morning. Asterisk, if you, like us, believe that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from following the maps, but from questioning where the maps came from in the first place. Click the subscribe button and tell us in the comments what part of the world you're watching from. Asterisk. The first rule of gold prospecting in 1869 Australia. When you find something, you keep your mouth shut. Deason crouches over the object. It's partially exposed now, a dark, oxidized mass encrusted with clay and tree roots. His first thought is that it's a boulder. Sandstone, maybe, or a chunk of ironstone. But the color is wrong. Even covered in dirt, he can see patches of metallic yellow showing through. He scrapes with his knife. The surface beneath yields not rock hard, but slightly malleable. The kind of give you get from soft metal. He calls Oates over without raising his voice. They don't speak. They both understand the problem. Bulldog Gully is crowded. Not with active miners, most claims here are abandoned, but with drifters. Failed prospectors. Men who'd kill you for a horse or a bag of flour. News of a significant find would spread through Moleagle in hours. And by nightfall, they'd have claim jumpers with shotguns. Asserting prior rights to the ground, Deason makes the decision. They wait until dark. He covers the exposed section with loose dirt and leaves. They spend the rest of the day doing normal prospecting work, washing gravel at their sluice box, making just enough noise and activity to suggest nothing unusual has happened. Other miners pass within 50 yards. Nobody notices. When the sun drops, they work. The how of extracting the nugget is where most accounts go vague, but we can reconstruct it from mining practices of the era. Alluvial gold nuggets aren't sitting loose in soil. They're typically embedded in compacted clay or cemented gravel, sometimes fused with quartz or ironstone. The larger the nugget, the more difficult the extraction. A fist-sized nugget might take an hour to carefully dig out. This object, still mostly buried, is clearly larger than a fist. Deason starts by clearing a perimeter. He digs a circular trench around the mass, about 3 feet in diameter. Going down carefully with a small spade to avoid striking the object directly. Gold is soft pure. Gold has a Mohs hardness of 2.5, roughly the same as a fingernail. A careless shovel strike could damage it, and damaged gold is worth less per ounce because it requires more refining. As the trench deepens, the true scale becomes apparent. The mass isn't basketball-sized. It's bigger than that. Much bigger. Deason hits one edge at 6 inches below the surface. He follows it laterally. 12 inches wide, then 18. He's now dug down 8 inches and still hasn't found the bottom. Oates brings a lantern. They work by its light, alternating between digging and carefully brushing away clay with their hands. The soil here is dense, tertiary, claretish, sticky, the kind that turns to concrete when dry and soup when wet. It has to be scraped away in small increments. By midnight, they've exposed the top half. The object is roughly triangular, widest at one end, tapering to a blunt point at the other. The surface is not smooth. It's covered in dendritic formations, branch-like. Structures of crystallized gold that grew over millennia as groundwater percolated through the deposit, slowly adding layers. These dendrites indicate this isn't a remelted nugget, but a primary deposit. Gold that crystallized directly from solution. Grain by grain. Over geological time, the mathematics of what they're looking at are staggering. Gold has a specific gravity of 19.3 grams per cubic centimeter, even accounting for quartz inclusions and iron oxide coatings. They're looking at an object that displaces roughly 4,000 cubic centimeters. That's over 77 kilograms of mass. If even 90% of that mass is goldened from what they can see. It appears to be nearly pure. They're holding 70 kilograms of elemental gold. At 1869, prices of £3 17 shillings per troy ounce, and with 32,150 troy ounces per metric ton, this single object is worth over £10,000. 10,000. That's 40 years of wages for a skilled laborer. It's enough to buy 500 acres of prime Victorian farmland outright. It's more money than either man has seen in their entire lives combined. They dig faster. The problem becomes structural. As they excavate beneath the nugget, they realize it's wedged between tree roots thick. Ancient roots from the stringy bark that's been growing here for possibly a century. The roots have grown around the gold, partially encasing it. Cutting the roots would destabilize the tree and potentially cause it to fall, crushing them or the nugget. Leaving the roots means they can't lift the mass cleanly. Deason makes a call. They'll lever it. They use their picks as pry bars, working them underneath the nugget at multiple points. The technique is dangerous. If the nugget shifts suddenly, it could break, or worse, trap their hands beneath 70 kilograms of metal and rock. But they have no winch, no block and tackle, no equipment designed for lifting heavy loads. It's muscle and leverage, or nothing. They pry. The nugget shifts. Roots snap with sounds like rifle cracks. Soil caves into the void beneath. Deason gets his hands underneath one end and lifts. The weight is immense, far heavier than a bag of wheat, heavier than an anvil. It takes both men, straining, to roll the mass up and out of the hole. It lies on the surface, crusted with clay bigger than a man's torso. They have no way to weigh it. They have no way to transport it. It's too heavy for their wheelbarrow, too valuable to risk on the 3-mile trip to Dunolly in darkness. They cover it with canvas and stand watch until dawn. Asterisk, at first light. They face the bureaucracy problem. The Victorian goldfields in 1869. Operated under the Mines Act of 1865, a Byzantine legal framework designed to prevent theft, fraud, and violence. Every ounce of gold extracted had to be documented, weighed by official assayers, and taxed before it could be sold. The government took 10% of gross value immediately, plus plus licensing fees, plus export duties if you tried to ship the gold overseas. The system existed because, in the early rush years, miners had simply melted their finds and smuggled them out of the colony, costing the crown millions in lost revenue. The law was explicit. Any gold find over 1 ounce had to be reported to the local gold commissioner within 48 hours. Failure to report was a criminal offense, punishable by confiscation of the gold and up to 2 years imprisonment. Deason and Oates have just found approximately 2,300 ounces. Reporting it means immediate government scrutiny, inspectors, surveyors, tax collectors. It also means publicity. The moment they walk into Dunelli with a nugget this size, every desperate man within 50 miles will know their names. But not reporting it isn't an option. The nugget is too large to hide, too heavy to move discreetly, too valuable to melt down in secret. Melting it would require a furnace capable of reaching 1,064 degrees Celsius, fuel to sustain that temperature for hours, and molds to cast the resulting bullion resources they don't have. Even if they could melt it, the resulting bars would be traceable. Victorian gold had a distinctive chemical signatures, specific ratios of silver and copper impurities that identified its origin. Assayers could tell at a glance if gold came from Ballarat versus Bendigo versus Moleagle. Trying to sell unregistered bullion would get them arrested immediately. They decide to follow the law. But they're not idiots. Deason constructs a sled. He uses timber from an old mining cradle, a device for washing graveland, lashes it together with rope. They lever the nugget onto the sled, cover it with sacking, and harness themselves to it like draft animals. The 3-mile trip to Dunelli takes 4 hours. The nugget gouges a furrow in the dirt road. Twice they have to stop and rest, hands blistered, shoulders screaming. They reach the London Chartered Bank at 11 a.m. The bank manager, a man named W.J. Baker, sees them dragging their burden through the door and assumes it's a joke. Miners occasionally brought in large specimens as pranks, boulders painted gold, lead weights wrapped in foil. Baker tells them to stop wasting his time. Deason unwraps the canvas. Baker goes pale. The bank's official scale platform balance. Designed for weighing grains, Sachs has a maximum capacity of 50 kilograms. The nugget is visibly heavier. They try anyway. The moment they heave the nugget onto the platform, scale arm slams down and stays down, the counterweight dangling uselessly. The scale is pegged. Baker sends a runner to fetch the gold commissioner, a man named C.W. Horn. Horn arrives with 2 constables. Suspicious this is either fraud or theft. He inspects the nugget with a hand lens, checking for the telltale signs of a casting mold marks, air bubbles, uniform crystallization. He finds none. The dendritic structures, the quartz inclusions, the layer of iron oxide patinol, consistent with natural formation. Horn makes his official report. I have this day inspected a mass of alluvial gold, in situ, extracted from a depth of less than 4 inches by John Deason and Richard Oates, claim holders at Bulldog Gully. The mass exceeds the capacity of available weighing apparatus. Transport to Melbourne is advised for official assay. But there's a problem. The Melbourne assay office is 110 miles away. The nugget is too heavy for a stagecoach. The springs would collapse. Sending it by wagon would require armed guards, and the cost of hiring those guards would eat into the nugget's value. Worse, transporting unweighed gold violated the Mines Act. You couldn't legally move gold across district boundaries without first determining its weight for tax purposes. Deason proposes the obvious solution: break it into pieces. Horn refuses. The Mines Act also prohibited willful damage to specimens of unusual size or scientific interest. The government wanted this nugget intact for display proof of Victoria's mineral wealth, a propaganda tool to attract more investment and immigration. Breaking it would constitute destruction of Crown property. They're at an impasse. The nugget is too heavy to weigh, too large to transport whole, and too valuable to damage. Deason loses his patience. He points out that he and Oates have been living on flour and rabbits for 6 months, that they need payment now. Not after some bureaucrat in Melbourne decides what's scientifically interesting. He tells Horn that if the government wants the nugget intact, the government can buy it from them right now in cash for a fair price. Otherwise, they're breaking it up and taking it to the assay office in pieces, legal or not. Horn telegraphs Melbourne. The reply comes back in 2 hours. Permit sectioning. Photograph first. Carry the nugget to the blacksmith shop. A photographer, J.W. Lint, who happened to be in Dunolly documenting the Goldfield stakes for plates before the light fails. Then the blacksmith, a man named Thomas, places the nugget on his anvil. The anvil is solid iron, 200 kilograms, mounted on an oak stump sunk 3 feet into the ground. Thomas uses a cold chisel and a 12-pound sledge. The first blow creates a crack along a natural fault line in the gold. The second blow opens the crack. The third blow splits the nugget into 2 unequal pieces, roughly 45 kilograms and 27 kilograms. The larger piece still doesn't fit on the bank scale. Thomas splits it again. Now they have 3 pieces, 32 kilograms, 23 kilograms, and 17 kilograms. Each piece is weighed separately. Total mass 72.04 kilograms. The assayer estimates 98.7% purity, meaning 71.1 kilograms of pure gold. At troy weight, that's 2,286 ounces. The Melbourne Argus publishes the news 3 days later under the headline, Monster Nuggetone Precedented Discovery at Molliagle. The article includes speculation that the find is a hoax. Skeptics in Melbourne argue that no nugget that large could have been so close to the surface without being found earlier. The Royal Society of Victoria appoints a committee to investigate. The committee examines Lint's photographs and the sectioned pieces, now stored in the Treasury vaults. They interviewed Deason, Oates, Baker, Horn, and Thomas. They send a surveyor to Bulldog Gully to measure the extraction site. Their conclusion, published in the Transactions of the Royal Society, the evidence is conclusive. The nugget, denominated Welcome Stranger, is authentic and represents the largest specimen of alluvial gold yet recorded. The government buys the nugget for £9,381, slightly below market rate, but immediate payment in cash. Deason and Oates split the money. After taxes and fees, each man nets approximately £4,000. Asterisk. The Welcome Stranger vindicated a philosophy that mining engineers and geologists had dismissed as superstition. The conventional wisdom of 1869 held that surface gold in Victoria was exhausted. Every respectable mining journal, every geological survey, every professional opinion agreed. The future of Australian gold lay in deep lead mining and reef crushing. Men who still scratched at surface alluvium were seen as relics, too stubborn or too stupid to accept reality. John Deason and Richard Oates proved that conventional wisdom wrong with a single find, worth more than all the deep lead shafts in Molliagle had produced in 5 years combined. The immediate effect was a minor gold rush. Within a week of the Argus article, over 300 prospectors descended on Bulldog Gully, tearing up every square foot of ground within a mile of Deason's original claim. They found nothing. The Welcome Stranger wasn't part of a larger deposit. It was a singular geological accident, a massive accumulation that had somehow avoided detection. Despite 15 years of intensive mining activity, but the secondary effects were more profound. Mining. Companies reevaluated their approach to worked-out ground. The assumption that surface alluvium had been thoroughly exploited was based on sampling data from 1851 to 1853. When prospecting techniques were crude and hundreds of thousands of men were quite literally trampling over the landscape, that data didn't account for gold concealed by post-rush erosion, vegetation growth, or simple oversight. Firms began hiring surface prospectors to re-examine abandoned claims before writing them off entirely. The Welcome Stranger also changed how nuggets were valued and preserved. Prior to 1869, large nuggets were routinely melted down immediately. Their value was in the gold content, not the form. After the Welcome Stranger, museums and collectors began paying premiums for intact specimens. The largest piece of the welcome stranger before it was melted was photographed and sketched extensively. Those images became iconic, reproduced in newspapers and mining journals worldwide. They served as proof that Australia still held extraordinary mineral wealth. The Royal Mint in London studied the nugget's composition and published a detailed assay report. The gold was 96.8% pure, with trace copper and silver consistent with Victorian alluvial deposits, but showing unusually low quartz inclusion. This data contributed to improved understanding of how alluvial gold forms, the conditions required for large-scale crystallization, and why certain creek systems concentrate gold more effectively than others. For Deason and Oates, the money meant radically different lives. Deason bought 300 acres of farmland near Moleagle, built a stone house, and lived as a gentleman farmer until his death in 1887. He never prospected again. Oates was younger and more reckless. He invested his share in a series of failed mining ventures, went broke by 1875, and ended up working as a mine laborer for wages. The irony wasn't lost on his contemporaries. The man who'd found the largest nugget in history died nearly penniless. The welcome stranger itself disappeared. After being weighed and photographed, the three pieces were transported to Melbourne and melted down by the Bank of England's agent, turned into standard 400-ounce bars for shipment to London. No intact portion survives. What remains are Lint's photographs, grainy, faded images showing a misshapen mass of golden metal that, for a brief moment, represented a fortune beyond imagining. But the story's legacy isn't really about the gold. It's about the validation of an approach to problem-solving that formal institutions consistently undervalue. Deason and Oates didn't have geological training, capital, or institutional backing. They had observation, persistence, and a willingness to question expert consensus. They worked ground that educated men had declared worthless, and they did so using techniques that mining engineers considered primitive. The modern equivalent would be a hobbyist in their garage, solving a problem that professional engineers at a Fortune 500 company insist requires millions in R&D funding. Except Deason and Oates weren't hobbyists. They were desperate men with their backs against the wall, doing the only thing they knew how to do. The geological explanation for why the welcome stranger was so close to the surface remains contested. The most accepted theory is that it formed in a now-eroded hillside quartz reef, was released by weathering, and then transported a short distance by an ancient creek before being buried by sediment accumulation over thousands of years. The tree growing above it may have been 80 to 100 years old, meaning the nugget was covered sometime in the late 18th century, decades before Europeans arrived in Australia. In other words, it was there the entire time. Through the entire gold rush, through thousands of miners trampling that exact spot, it just took someone willing to dig around an inconvenient tree root to find it. There's a monument at Bulldog Gully now, a stone cairn with a brass plaque marking the spot where the welcome stranger was found. Tourists visit. They take photos. The ground has been dug and redug so many times that the original contours are unrecognizable. But the lesson remains: the biggest discoveries, the ones that change everything, often aren't made by the people with the most resources or the best credentials. They're made by the people willing to look where everyone else has already decided there's nothing worth finding. Asterisk stories of practical ingenuity like this are everywhere, hidden in archives, forgotten by institutions, waiting for someone to excavate them. If you enjoyed this deep dive into how two men with shovels proved an entire industry wrong, subscribe for more, and don't forget to leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Until next time.